This is the Comics Alternative, episode 256. Reviews of Kid Lobotomy 1 and 2, Carnival of Contagion, and Monograph. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's review episode, Paul and I are going to look at three very interesting and actually quite different titles. We're going to begin with the first two issues of Peter Milligan and Tess Fowler's Kid Lobotomy. After that, we're going to look at Carnival of Contagion by Bob Hall, along with John West and Judy Diamond. And then we're going to wrap up by discussing Chris Ware's Monograph. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. One of the ways that you can have your mind blown is to check out the bundles. And it's the start of the month, and so the new bundles and specials are up at DCBS. You should check those out. Some of those bundles will get you 50% off of bundles of Valiant Comics or Marvel Legacy or the DC Valiant or DC Vertigo or DC miniseries or the Rebirth stuff or the New Age of DC Heroes. You're going to find all kinds of bundles, 50% off, many of them, and just incredible discounts on great bundles of comics. So check those out at DCB, Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. Check out dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs, or almost with PhDs, sent you.
That's right.
Well, Paul, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this week's episode, I want to mention a couple of things to our listening audience.
Yes.
As I guess a radio personality would say. One thing, and I've mentioned this on a previous episode, but I want to say something about it on our regular review show. I've started a brand new weekly series as part of the Comics Alternative called Comics Alternative Kickstarter. And for the past 2 Saturdays, I've been putting up brief, like about 15, 17-minute conversations with comics creators who are currently kickstarting a particular project, projects that fall within the wheelhouse of primarily what we discuss on the Comics Alternative. These, as I said, are going to be very short episodes, definitely not the hour or so long interviews that we do for our interview series, but just quick in-and-out conversations with a creator or a creative team of a comics-related Kickstarter program. And I wanted to do that because the vast majority of people who kickstart something on comics on Kickstarter are doing it because, I don't know, they would otherwise self-publish, or they're going to be very small presses who definitely need the help. And those are the kind of comics that we discuss on the Comics Alternative. So I thought, why not give some of these projects a little attention, and we can learn about them as well. So we've had 2 episodes so far, and there are plenty of comics-related Kickstarter projects. So we're not going to run out of material. So every Saturday, and these episodes will go up on Saturday morning, you can find out about a new comics project trying to get off the ground on Kickstarter.
Yeah. Derek, I've enjoyed those episodes a lot. I've been listening in, and let me just say, I get to say this kind of thing now and then, even though I am here as a co-host, keeping the seat warm for Andy always. As one of the not, canonical two guys, I'm also a comics alternative listener, and I feel like, the reason I'm here and the reason I get so excited about talking to you, Derek, is I feel like you do such a service to the industry, the culture, because of the kind of comics that the comics alternative covers, and I have really enjoyed these Kickstarter episodes because I do go on Kickstarter from time to time and browse the comics projects that are there, and it's just really exciting to hear voices of people who are launching projects there, and so I love that we're doing that coverage, and you've done a great job with it.
Oh, thanks. That kind of reaction makes me feel good that I'm not just doing this just to be doing something. And in fact, so Paul, I appreciate the comments. And if our listeners hear something on one of these Kickstarter shows and they actually decide to back it, let us know. Get in touch with us via email, Twitter, Facebook, social media, anyway, and just let us know, hey, I heard about this Kickstarter project. I backed it after listening to your show, because I'd like to know what kind of reach we get with this.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. And hey, while you're at it, let the creators know too that whose project you supported, that Derek sent you that way, and I think that would be nice, a nice way to acknowledge the work that you do, Derek.
Oh, okay. Another thing I'd like to encourage our listeners to do is to sign up for our Slack channel, which is the second thing I wanted to mention before we get to our reviews. I have recently set up a Slack channel for the Comics Alternative, and you can join it, can be a part of this discussion community by going to comicsalternative.com/Slack, SLACK. And this is new. I hope that we can conduct discussions, conversations, create community on the Slack channel in ways that I had wanted our discussion forum to do. I took down the discussion forum, but in its place, I've put up a link for our Slack channel. This is on the Comics Alternative website. And the forum, people contributed to it once in a while, but not often, and then every now and again there would be some kind of spammer that would get on there, so I'd have to clear them off. So I took the forum down, and in its place I put up a link for our Slack channel. So definitely check that out, comicsalternative.com/Slack, and join up.
That's right. And I don't use Slack for anything else, but I've known of Slack, and I know friends who use it for work purposes or even for conversations such as these, as a discussion board. And so I was excited to see that you had started it. I jumped on, and there have been some fun interactions, people recommending and talking about comics. There's different threads that there's been some fun chatting. So we'd love to see some of you all listeners out there.
Yeah, definitely check it out and come talk with us. Okay, Paul, let's go ahead and begin discussing the first title that we're going to be looking at this week, and this is Kid Lobotomy. This is written by Peter Milligan with art by Tess Fowler, and this is coming out through IDW's new Black Crown series. In fact, I think this is the first title to come out from Black Crown. Yep. The only other title that has been released is the very first issue of, what is it, that anthology?
Quarterly, the Black Crown Quarterly.
Yeah, the Black Crown Quarterly, which actually at the comic shop that I go to here in Charlotte, I just picked up because I forgot to pre-order it, but I haven't had the chance to look at it yet. Now, the first issue of Kid Lobotomy came out last month, and just last week, the first issue, or the second issue of Kid Lobotomy was released. And so we're going to be talking about the first two issues.
I think actually this week it's coming out.
Oh, is it this week that it's coming out?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Our review copy became available to us last week.
That's right.
So it comes out this week. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
So we can talk about this series in a more informed way than we could have, let's say, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And how do I begin? Let me just ask, what are your initial thoughts of Kid Lobotomy?
I have a different feeling after reading issue 2 than I had after reading issue 1. My initial feeling about it was, so the Black Crown imprint is under IDW, but started by Shelly Bond, of course, who is, one of the eminent names, the goddess of Vertigo, so to speak, and somebody who launched many ships of great comic series that, listeners of this podcast have probably loved. And with pedigree like Peter Milligan's, you kind of expected a certain kind of Vertigo-like sensibility about it. One of the things that I think of when I think of Vertigo series is that there's a sort of essence of the punk generation that comes across in a lot of really great Vertigo series, and that I don't know, that it's not a genre, that mood, that time, that ethos is something that is always a little bit hard for me to get into, always a little bit maybe intentionally so, not easy to penetrate. Once I do find my way into it, though, I always appreciate it. I always like it. And so Kid Lobotomy #1 I found so strange, and I knew that it was intentionally being so, that it was a little bit off-putting for me. After rereading issues 1 and 2, and we can talk a little bit about what exactly happens in those issues in a moment, I find myself more drawn to the work and more interested in what it's talking about and what it's doing. So I'm on board. I think if it weren't Peter Milligan, if it weren't Tess Fowler, if it wasn't Shelly Bond, I might have jumped off the train. But I think they have a lot of credibility with me. So I'm going to keep reading it, and I'm starting to get a sense of what exactly is going on. I do think that it was intentionally a little bit elusive to catch on. And so, some people I think were off put, by that difficulty.
Yeah. What you've said, actually a number of things that you've said are ways into the first 2 issues of this new series. And the reason I hesitated at first about where do I want to go with this is because I didn't want to start off negative. That's not to suggest that I'm going to be completely negative, because we try not to be overly negative on the Comics Alternative podcast. It's just there was something a little, as you put it, elusive and at times even frustrating about Kid Lobotomy. Definitely after the first issue, but I think for me at least, even after reading issue number 2, like you, I really do love the artwork of Tess Fowler. This is someone who has done work for Rat Queens, a title that I really enjoy. I like Peter Milligan's work. I don't know if every project of his is right on the money. I mean, for instance, he had that Vertigo series last year, I think it was, Discipline, that was okay, but it didn't bowl me over. But nonetheless, I do like the work of Peter Milligan. And then Shelly Bond, you're right, she's a legend with Vertigo. And in fact, I find it interesting that both Bond and Karen Berger, who, another big name behind Vertigo, who really put it on the map, have gone to different presses and have their own imprint. So with Shelly Bond, it's this new Black Crown series, and over at Dark Horse, it's Berger Books, which, I've said on a previous show, it does sound a little weird, Berger Books, and not just because it's alliterative, but and I wish both of them well with these new imprints. I do have to say that the intro in the first issue, and I think she also writes a little bit in the second issue, from Shelly Bond, is, at least it comes across to me, maybe I'm being a little too cynical here, as a little overtly too hip. In other words, she's trying too hard. And I think that this Black Crown series can be really good. It's just I don't want to be hit over the head with how hip, how now, how different this is. In other words, show, don't tell me. And I would like for both Milligan and Fowler to show me how this series, this first ongoing issue, and this new imprint can be. But even that I can excuse. It's like, maybe that's just me being a little too particular, right? Thinking that Shelly Bond's intro in the first issue tried a little too hard to get me interested. Now, we have the second issue out this week of Kid Lobotomy, and I would think that by the second issue, I would have a pretty good sense of what's going on with this new series. I'm probably a little more confused than you are, apparently, after issue number 2, because I'm still kind of wondering what's going on, what the relationships are. We seem to have 2 different events taking place in the first 2 issues. With issue number 1, we have Kid Lobotomy helping out a guy who can't get a song out of his head. And then with issue number 2, we have an event with an author named Adam Mee, M-E-E, who becomes a player. But also there are other things that go on in issue number 2, just as there are multiple things that go on in issue number 1.
Yeah.
And this may be a good time to talk about what apparently goes on, or what this series is about, because I'm still a little unclear about this. Now, so correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that, Kid Lobotomy is called Kid Lobotomy because he helps people through this particular technique, and I can't remember the name of the technique. Where
cranial something or other.
Yeah, where a device is used to go inside the head and in a certain way kind of lobotomize someone to take out whatever part of the brain is causing them problems. And that Kid Lobotomy eats that part of the brain, is because that's what I see in the first issue. I don't see him eating brains, and I'm not talking about zombie, right? In the second issue, I don't see him doing that, but in the first issue, in the opening pages, he's doing that, and I'm thinking, okay, they're getting off to a rather gross start, but hey, I'm, this is Peter Milligan. I'm okay with this, and I want to see what happens. But then after those first few pages of issue number 1, I don't see anything like that. So I'm not sure if that's what the shtick is with this series or what. I mean, how did you read that?
Yeah, well, no, I totally agree with you. I don't know that I have any more light to shed on it than you do. We can also throw in the other elements here. There's also this hotel, it's called the Suites, that is originally owned by Kid Lobotomy's father, that he's now passed on to... Yeah, Big Daddy, who's a sort of Burl Ives cat on a hot tin roof character. He's passed that on to his to Kid Lobotomy, and there's a sister with whom he has a strange incestuous attraction, love-hate thing going on, where she seems resentful that he's inherited the Suites, and she's in the mix. And meanwhile, there's also giant cockroaches, as you said, the subcranial procedure, and it's bananas. It's it's pretty crazy. It's has a very pastiche feeling. There's allusions to, I mentioned cockroaches, but Kafka and the Metamorphosis, of course. There's allusions to William S. Burroughs and his sort of cut up technique of quote unquote narrative, and so it seems to be very intentionally signaling that this is going to be somewhat, abstruse, and again, as I said, maybe a little bit impenetrable. And I do think that Milligan and Fowler and Bond, to some extent, are banking on a certain amount of their credibility from past work to say, you have to trust us on this. This is going somewhere. But I think that that's a limited rope. Oh, I forgot to mention there's a shapeshifter. There's a shapeshifter in here as well. I do think that part of this. Yes, Otla, wonderful name. There's a point early on where Kid Lobotomy, outright says something to the effect of, "I hired all these employees, but I don't remember them. I don't remember hiring them." And so the whole unreliable, collapsing narrator, trope is clearly at work. And so whether anything that's happening is to be sort of taken at face value is already long out the window. And so again, I think it's a question of, and I think this actually bothers me. It's a certain question of like how trusting and really how, I don't know, literary do we feel we have to be or want to be or want to prove ourselves to be to keep going with them into this craziness. And I think there's a limit of that for me, and maybe that's my own shortcomings as a reader. But not enough things have come together at the end of even 2 issues for me that I'm like, I like this. Enough has come together, though, that, again, I'm willing to stick around for the ride, but I don't know how many more issues I will before things have to start locking in for me, if that's fair to say.
You know, I think I'm where you are in that even after the second issue, which I would think that by the second issue I'd have a better sense of where this series is going, what it's about.
Right.
I don't. But given the talent here, we mentioned legendary figures like Peter Milligan, Tess Fowler's a little newer, but I do love her art. And then Shelly Bond. It's like, okay, I'm going to give them a little more rope. In other words, a little more time to really get their hooks in me with this series. So I'm willing to put up with this confusion to a point. But the question is, after how many issues? Like, for instance, if I get to issue 3 and then definitely 4, and I'm still scratching my head trying to make sense of this, wondering what is the trajectory? What should I latch onto? Then I may just give things up. But given this creative team, I'll put up with it for a while. Right.
Yeah. I think I'm with you there. The opening of the second issue features this, as you were mentioning, this writer who is, says of himself that he's won a Pulitzer, which for his first novel, which was written on the run after on the run from the feds after he farted at the White House. And then he says, you've probably read The Me Generation, which is the title, I guess, of that first novel. After his first name, as you mentioned, it was Adam Me. No, of course you didn't fucking understand it. Which I feel like that character is the creator saying, okay, if you are concerned that you're trusting a bunch of, pretentious, ironic, artsy types, let us put that character in the story and, sort of ironically make fun of that character a little bit. And it distances themselves from that, that position a little bit. But I do think there's this, the sensibility I get off of, Black Crown generally, and maybe this is just me, is that Black Crown is like punk that has grown up and has already sent their kids off to college, and now is reminded by Trump and the politics that we need punk back, And so let's roll up our sleeves and get back into this. And and so when I think of it that way, I'm like, okay, all right, I'm down. I have gone with you to many stories. I mean, I think of even throwing something like the Sandman into that camp, and it's been rewarding for me to go to those uncomfortable places. But I just, generationally, it's a little bit not where I naturally fit in. So I think that's where they get that extra rope that you were alluding to, where I'm still willing to roll with it. But I do need some payoff pretty soon, is what I'm feeling.
Yeah, and you mentioned this is intentionally punk, and I get that, and I think that on the one hand that's a good thing. On the other hand, maybe what we need in these times, comics and otherwise, is not necessarily punk, but what you could call a punk equivalent for our time, our current time, right? Because there's no way to go back and recapture exactly what, let's say, the Ramones did, what Paul Weller and the Jam did, right? I mean, you get pale imitations, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't have the impact of the original. So in trying to recapture what once had been the kind of writing and art that we used to see from Vertigo, trying to recapture that. On the one hand, I'm okay with that because, I've said it many times on the show. I love Vertigo. Even now, I'm on board for anything that they'll do. At the same time, though, I come back to something that I said earlier. It seems to me that in these first 2 issues, they're trying a little too hard to recapture that. And in doing so, I'm wondering how genuine this impact is going to be. Now, part of the problem with these first 2 issues, and I was thinking about this when you were mentioning the many moving pieces of this series just after 2 issues, right? I mean, we have someone who may or may not eat brains in order to help people surgically, someone whose memory is screwed up. So, Kid Lobotomy is the narrator. So he's an unreliable narrator. We have a shapeshifter. We have Big Daddy. We have other colorful characters. In other words, there seem to be, to use another metaphor, too many balls being juggled. And I'm wondering if, and again, this may not be fair judging this by just 2 issues, but if maybe Milligan is doing too much in order to be a little offbeat, wacky, punk, whatever you want to call it, that if he had maybe scaled down a bit and took a little more of a solid narrative trajectory, that even by the 2nd issue, I'd have a pretty good sense of where this may be going. Then I think I'd like it a little more. But again, because it's Milligan, Fowler, and Bond, I'm willing to stick around for at least a couple of more issues to see if things start to gel.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I'm with you on what you're saying, maybe about this coming from a generational source and impulse. I think one of the things they intentionally are doing with Black Crown is to pair a legendary veteran creator with a newer creator, and I think that's the intention of pairing Fowler with Milligan, for instance. And I do think that these imprints, both this and maybe Burger Books to some extent, are in the wake of Young Animal doing really well, which is kind of an interesting contrast and comparison. Gerard Way being obviously of a different generation, but having the same kind of edgy and very different storytelling exist and do as well as those books have done. But I know what you mean about the pastichiness. I don't know. Do you know Stefan from Saturday Night Live? Have you seen Stefan before?
I really don't watch Saturday Night Live anymore.
Okay. It's just a recurring segment that was on, a character that was on Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live. And the whole joke is that it's kind of a joke and it's also kind of awesome. He just appears on Weekend Updates with recommendations for like the nightlife in New York, but they're so offbeat and just like crazy. The things he's like, I can't even imitate it. But anybody who's listening who knows Stefan will probably know what I mean, in that you describe the elements of this book, and it just seems so, random and crazy that, I don't know if I'm just dense, but I don't think I'm that dense. So I guess we'll put this book on the temporary poll to see, what's going to happen.
Yeah. So I do have, I don't know if I'd say high hopes. I have positive hopes for Kid Lobotomy. I look forward to reading that first issue of Black Crown Quarterly. And then that other new series that's coming up with, what's it called? That Gilbert Hernandez is doing.
Assassinistas.
Assassinistas, that's right. Yes. I'm definitely going to read that because, it's Gilbert Hernandez.
Gilbert, right.
But, I do hope that this imprint takes off and it is a shot in the arm for IDW because, I really like IDW, but when I think of IDW, at least the things that resonate with me, I think of their books, their collections, right? Because, after all, they're the ones who publish, Dean Mullaney's series, Craig Yo's Yo book series. And they do a great job at
editions.
That. Oh, exactly, yeah. When it comes to single issues of comic books, more times than not, those are licensed properties, which, again, nothing wrong with that, It's just that I don't read Star Trek anymore, and the other things that they license they just aren't in my wheelhouse. And so this is something that I could definitely latch on to.
Yeah.
The Black Crown books. And so I do, wish them the best for this.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I love IDW. I mean, having Top Shelf under them now, and then these various investments that they've made, I think this is a noteworthy investment. And so I'm looking forward to Assassinistas, as you said, with Gilbert and Teeny Howard. And the lineup looks great. And I think overall it's positive. But I guess it sounds like we're at the same place here where, hopefully we can connect a little bit more with what's to come from it. There's also a series from David Barnett and Martin Simmons called Punk's Not Dead, which again seems to be of the similar tone.
Now, when is the first issue of that going to come out?
February, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it hasn't been solicited yet.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it'll probably appear in the December catalog.
Yeah,
previews,
and you'll hear about it here on the Comics Alternative.
That's right. Well, Paul, you want to move on to the second title that we're looking at this week?
Yeah, because this is really interesting. This will be an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, this is something that I think many of our readers may not be aware of. It would kind of fall under their radar because its system of distribution is very different from, I think, how most people get their comics. In other words, I don't think that this is a title that people will find in their local comic shop.
Right.
Yeah, this is a book called Carnival of Contagion. It is written by Bob Hall with, and I guess assistants in some way, maybe fact-checking, science or whatnot, John West and Judy Diamond, and the art is by Bob Hall. And this is coming out from the University of Nebraska. This came out the beginning of October. Right. And it's also, at least on the copyright page, apparently it was also supported by the Science Education Partnership. It got that award. And the University of Nebraska State Museum. Now, as you can probably tell from that setup, this is a book that has to deal with science. And the title, Carnival of Contagion, in many ways describes what this is about. This is an educational comic. I guess, I'm calling it a comic or comic book-like text because it's about 30-some pages of comics story. There's a short essay by Carl Zimmer that talks about contagious diseases in the back. It looks like a trade, but it's a really thin trade. Right. But it's about the length of a longer comic book.
Right. Yeah, I'd say physically it's suspended between a single issue comic book that you might find on a comic book shelf, except you won't. Right. and a sort of a light, thin trade, which seems to me that it's trying to make its way into, say, a library, maybe even a school library, where somebody would see it and mistake it for not mistake it, but recognize the signifiers of a comic book. And in fact, the art style, Bob Hall is a real classic superhero, comics creator, artist. That art style kind of gives away this is a comic book, but with a sort of informative and scientific, really a public health purpose to it.
Right. And this is basically the story, if we can call it a story, of this character by the name of Boris the Barker Morbilius and his, I guess, friend or colleague, this dragon Rubiola. And both Morbilius and Rubiola are different names for measles. Right. And so the Carnival of Contagion, so to speak, comes to town, to this one community, and the narrative begins, I guess we're introduced to Boris and Rubiola, but then we see at this event there is a doctor who's talking to a crowd, mostly of young people, but even older individuals, saying that it's really important to be vaccinated. And specifically, measles is the target because on the one hand, people may think that that's not a big deal. It can be quite debilitating, depending, even deadly. And so, we get a group of about 4 young people who are saying, well, I haven't had it because who gets measles anymore? It was almost completely wiped out, a few decades ago. And then, of course, the lesson here that we learn is that they can become susceptible because they are susceptibles, right? They haven't been vaccinated, and the virus can live in them. And even if it doesn't manifest itself immediately, they become carriers and can infect other people. And so they end up going to this quote unquote carnival that becomes a little surreal. I mean, who knows? Maybe Bob Hall was smoking something as he was writing this along with John West and Judy Diamond, because it does get really strange, almost like an LSD dream, right? Or, since we're talking about measles, I mean, maybe they're having some kind of fever dream. Sure. In the writing of this, because that's what these young people go through, right? And they're wondering what's happening to our world. This is like some kind of weird dream experience, but they're being taken through this carnival that becomes rather scary. And so with Boris the Barker taking them on this journey, I mean, he shows them in essence how dangerous this can be, but he's also luring them in as susceptibles.
Right.
This is largely an educational comic, and I think that this would work well with hospitals, clinics, and whatnot in terms of educating the public on the importance of vaccination. Because, every now and again we hear news stories that parents think, I don't believe in vaccination. There's something a little suspicious about it. It causes any number. In other words, these urban myths that it causes other kinds of ailments and retardation or what have you.
Right.
Which is just bunk.
Right. It's been debunked scientifically, but there is a strong anti-vax community. I mean, I know people who have made that decision for themselves and their children, and I do think the book is trying to confront it from a public health perspective, but deeply informed by the science. So, the problem is partially how is one individual affected, but also trying to really make the point that vulnerability in the population allows it to spread, And so there's the cover and the Barker character and the whole notion of contagion is really meant to be a sort of, I think, a really sort of a horrific picture that puts a burden of responsibility on the reader, who must know that this is intended to be, some a packaging of science for people to say, if I'm not doing vaccines, it's not only that I'm, potentially harming myself, but also the general population. I feel like that's the takeaway, intended takeaway of the story.
Yeah. I think you put your finger on it. We started off talking about Carnival of Contagion by making a reference to where our listeners probably will not find this title.
Right.
And I was looking at the copyright page, and I noticed something actually just now. I didn't notice this before. When you have some of the other copyright information, like, University of Nebraska Press, 2017, it gives information. It says audience age 15 through 18, and then next to that, audience grade 9 through 12. I don't know of any other comic or graphic novel that on its copyright page gives any kind of information about the audience or specifically the grade. And I'm wondering if the creators behind this are intending to have this used in the classroom. So you may not be able to find it in bookstores or in comic shops, but this is something that schools may purchase in mass and then distribute to students. I mean, I don't know, but the fact that information was listed there about the audience in terms of what grade, 9 through 12, tells me that this is something that may be intended to be used in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think for folks interested, if they're, particularly if they're in the graphic medicine work, which I think is just really incredible, inspiring, and important work in terms of applying comics to, medical health, mental health, those sorts of areas. This is so we mentioned the Science Education Partnership Award, which is actually a National Institutes of Health thing and and there's a website, biologyofhuman.unl, which is for University of Nebraska and Lincoln, biologyofhuman.unl.edu, where you can find, I don't think this text is there yet, but there's actually a number of other texts, including comics and other kinds of media, and even lesson guides that go with them. So I do think that this is part of a sort of, this could be used by schools or as part of a broader public health campaign. But I think it's interesting as an artifact because it is also very much comics. So I can imagine whether you're a adolescent or maybe a young adult to whom this is given, it's not the kind of thing that appeals to me right off the bat. But I always try to read something with, assuming that maybe I'm not the audience. And so if I were, like, who would I be that this would be trying to appeal to? For instance, the Barker character, Boris the Barker, riding on I forgot the name of the dragon, is right there on the cover. When I see something like that,
Rubiola.
I'm like,
yeah.
Thank you. Rubiola, neither Rubiola nor Boris the Barker make me really want to read a comic. Not the way that, say, Maris Wicks in Human Body Theater has this really appealing skeleton figure who's going to walk me through the science. Or as you talked to Andy Hirsch a few weeks back with Gwen,
that's right,
about the Science Comics dogs, like the cuteness of the dog is going to carry me through. Maybe there's an intentional messaging where this message, part of the approach is that this message is meant to people for whom, I don't know, maybe this kind of cover and this kind of aesthetic is something interesting to them. And so I don't want to assume that just because it doesn't jump off the page at me as something I want to read, that it's not so for somebody else.
That's a good point. And I'm like you in that this kind of comics narrative, story, or lesson in this case is not one that immediately appeals to me. But again, I'm probably not I'm definitely, I guess, not the intended audience for this. I think educational comics can be incredible. You mentioned graphic medicine, those kind of comics, the first, second science comics. I think that comics as education can be done really well. This one, I think it accomplishes what it sets out to do, but it does so in a way that strikes me as a little dry. And I can't help but think that this is a way to connect it to the title that we were just discussing, Kid Lobotomy, in that both of them perhaps try a little too hard to do what they're doing. I said one of my issues with Kid Lobotomy, from the story to Shelly Bond's brief pieces in the first issue, her little short essay, seemed to be kind of pushing things a little too much in order to be, say, see how hip and punk we are, or something to that effect. And here, it's more overtly didactic. Not didactic in a negative way. I don't want to suggest that. I do. Again, it accomplishes what it sets out to do, but I think that it tries, obviously so, to teach a lesson. Whereas something like, let's say, Andy Hirsch's recent book on dogs for First Second Science comic series doesn't do that. It, first and foremost, it entertains, but then part of that entertainment is the lessons that you get along the way, the education, learning about dogs. Here, it seems that the emphasis is on teaching a lesson and not so much the story, which, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. So, that's one way I would connect Carnival of Contagion to Kid Lobotomy, and we can talk about this in a moment. Arguably, maybe the third title we're going to discuss today, Chris Ware's Monograph, in terms of trying too hard to do what it does.
That's interesting.
Maybe I'm pushing that with the third title that we're going to be discussing, but
no. I think that there is a through line in what you're. I'm sorry, and I hope I didn't cut you off.
No.
Okay, there's a through line. Shelly Bond, in one of those letters she writes, or whatever, calls herself editor, curator, time traveler. And I think that the idea that she's somehow a time traveler, whatever she means by that, is is relevant here, and then also super relevant when we talk about Monograph, by Chris Ware. Bob Hall is the artist of one of my sort of favorite comics to sort of dip back to from the past, which is the Mark Gruenwald Squadron Supreme from the mid '80s.
Oh, that's right.
Came out around the time of The Watchmen, and so I feel like one thing in reading this comic is that the art style, for those of us who read comics all the time, feels a little dated. Even the cell phones that the young people carry don't look anything like cell phones that young people carried. They look a little bit like cell phones that young people carry these days, but they're just kind of funny, large rectangles. and then the design of the character again. And again, I always make allowances that this is not aimed at me, that this might be aimed at somebody else for whom this, some of the aesthetics of these, sort of goblin characters and so on might be appealing, but I do think that. So I have a lot of respect for an artist like Bob Hall, who I think is probably in his 60s or 70s or something like that, and the work that he's done. I do think that having him he is the comics maker here, and it feels to me like he's made a comic that is a little bit dated in terms of how you speak to adolescents, to my knowledge today. Nevertheless, I think you're right that this is information first priority, narrative second priority. Mm-hmm. And so I want to judge it on its own terms. And so the terms I want to judge it on is how well does it convey to an adolescent that I imagine that central idea that I was saying earlier about, like, we need to get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so if that's your, criteria, I think it's pretty effective in doing that. It makes it feel awfully terrible and horrifying to neglect that,
Right.
So for that purpose, I think it's successful.
Yeah. And, I did learn some things. Not right. necessarily just about measles, but also some of the history surrounding the research into measles. For instance, I didn't even know who Peter Panem was. Right. But between Hall's story and the essay in the back by Carl Zimmer, which is titled Master of Contagion, I learned who Peter Panem was. And, he's a Dutch doctor. And even though, he didn't completely diagnose and pinpoint measles, to determine, this is caused by virus that has passed on, he observed it in a way that led to the discovery in the 1950s of what exactly causes measles, which led to in the 70s vaccinations on a large scale. So, you do learn something from this comic, and I agree with you that the art style does seem a little 1980s-ish, which I have no problem with. Right. But again, the emphasis here is on teaching a lesson, not as much on entertainment, even though in its own way it is entertaining.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Paul, you want to move on to the final text that we're going to be looking at this week?
Yes, I do. But if I may, I need to shift everything on my table because I need to make about 5 feet of space.
Oh,
for this
God.
text.
Yeah. And in fact, that may be an interesting place to start with this discussion of Chris Ware's Monograph. Right. This came out on October 17th from Rizzoli. And it's not as if we see comics published through Rizzoli. Rizzoli is known primarily as an art book publisher. Mm-hmm. They do a lot of really nice art books, photography, things of that sort. They're many times large volumes, almost like coffee table books at times. But I don't even know if I would call this a comic. It's definitely not a comic book by any stretch of the imagination. Right. It's not a graphic novel. It's something completely other, which is what we come to expect from Chris Ware.
Sure.
Now, you were talking about clearing off space. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to hold this as we discuss it. I'm looking at the page that it has on Amazon at the dimensions of this. Okay, so Amazon lists the product dimensions as 13.2 inches by 1.3 by 18.4. So it's a little over 18 inches tall, 13 inches wide. It's 280 pages. And I swear, if Chris Ware comes out with another text that is difficult to consume, I may give up on him. No, I'm not, because I love the work of Chris Ware. But I know one of the things that Andy Kunka and I discussed a few years ago when we reviewed Building Stories was how difficult parts of it were to read. In other words, there's some parts that you can easily hold and your arm won't go to sleep. There are other things, though, components to Building Stories that you try to read, but you can't hold comfortably. And then you have to set down on a surface, a table or a desk of some sort. This is definitely one of those texts where you have to set it down or you have to have strong arms in order to read it by holding it, because it is a hefty tome, physically speaking. And, for what it is, I think it's fascinating. But it's, to me at least, it's one of those books that I'm not going to read from front to back. It's something, I definitely wouldn't call it a coffee table book. I think it's an amalgamation of a number of things, and we can talk about that. But it's something that I think, for me at least as a reader, I will read parts of and then come back to later to read other parts and then come back to it another time.
Yes.
So it's something almost like a coffee table book, but again, not quite.
Yeah. I think it's fair to put an asterisk on this review because I haven't read every bit and piece, every morsel of this massive book. And it's massive not just in its dimensions, but also in a true Chris Ware fashion. Every page is filled with language and detail and design, which you can sort of, worm into for hours on end. So really, I didn't finish the entire book, but I spent plenty of time, and I pre-ordered this book when Amazon shipped it in a gigantic box. My wife said, "What furniture did you buy?" and I have been dipping into it every couple of days for weeks now. So it is, this is not the thing you give somebody who doesn't know Chris Ware's work, but anybody who has, read any amount of his 30-year output, and, Chris Ware is, of course, a legend in comics. There's going to be, as soon as I opened it, I just shook my head and I was like, this is so Chris Ware. To make it that difficult to access, but he seems very intentional about that. That's, I think, part of his shtick. In fact, a little story. This morning, I was preparing for this discussion. I had to drop my daughter off at school, and then I had to run to campus. So I stopped at a cafe to jot down some more notes. And I got to the cafe, and I was like, should I bring the book down? This is a cafe where I occasionally work on my academic writing, and I went ahead and I was like, let's see what happens. So I brought the book down. I saw a familiar face, somebody who was also an educator. She saw me. She regularly sees me working my dissertation, and she says, "What's that?" And because I had it on the table in front of me. And so I explained, Chris Ware, this is always where you start when you're talking to a non-comics person about a cartoonist or somebody like Chris Ware. Oh, he does New Yorker covers, and then I talked about, and he does comics, and this is a book that's a combination of, sort of a little bit of autobiography and essays, and it's kind of an art book and artifact curation. And I kept trying to see if this, person would be impressed that I was reading this. And she said, "You should get back to work. I'm going to tell your wife you're not working on your work." And, just the way that Chris Ware writes about himself, his own work, even though he's been celebrated and, This American Life and all this kind of stuff and all kinds of awards, he still talks about himself and the comics medium in the sort of self-effacing fashion that he does. It's stuff like that that just makes that happen. So in a way, the book being this large, I feel like is almost a provocation. It's Chris Ware going like, we're going to unapologetically be this materially insistent on what I am, and you just have to deal with it.
Right. And, this book is quite a number of things. It is, as Ware points out toward the beginning of this book, because there is, I guess we could say, a narrative that flows throughout this entire text. And it's the story of his own life as an artist, as a cartoonist, as a comics creator, and the things that he has created along the way, starting from his early days when he was growing up in Nebraska as a kid, and there's a lot about his family in there, to, moving to Texas, going to University of Texas, the flagship university in Austin, and then moving to Chicago and really catching on to become the kind of Chris Ware that we recognize today. Right. So in some ways, this is almost an autobiography, but it's one in which we get, I guess, curated a number of illustrations and photographs of his work. And as he points out at the intro, some of this is almost like a greatest hits, right? So we get to see many of the illustrations that those of us who know Chris Ware's work definitely recognize, right? Yeah. There's a lot of attention, almost in the exact middle of the book, paid to Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on earth, which is, I guess, primarily what he's known for.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But there's also a large section devoted to building stories, which is more toward the latter part of this text. So we do get some of these kind of greatest hits, as he calls them, of his comics, but we also get some drafts, some behind the scene images or photographs. We get a lot of images, both in terms of drafts and also photographs of the various items that he has created, whether they be dolls or machines or boxes of some sort that kind of complement some of the comics that he's done throughout his life. And so I find that fascinating. So, I mean, the book is a kind of a variety of different things all at once. I wondered about it when I first saw this listed on Amazon, or at least solicited in previews. It's called Monograph. And it's like, so what does that title mean, and what is this book going to be? Right. And, if you look up the definition of the word monograph, and I'm looking at Merriam-Webster's right now, it defines monograph as a learned treatise on a small area of learning. And I think that's what most people understand the word monograph meaning. Right. But I'm glad that in his, at least the initial part of this book, when Chris Ware's talking about calling this monograph, he breaks the word into two components, mono and graph. The mono part, as he points out, is him alone doing this. And that's more or less how he, as he describes it, defines his own career. That it's not as if this is a person who doesn't like to be with other people. He apparently does, because there are tons of photographs of him with a variety of different individuals, family members, his wife, and definitely other comics creators. Yeah. But he works alone, and he enjoys that. I mean, that's the best part of comics, he tells us, is not the creation of comics as much as it is working alone. By himself. And so that's the mono part of this. And the graph is the illustration component. So working alone on illustration is how he is using the word, or why he's using the title monograph, which I thought was clever. I like that, and that made sense to me. So that scratched that itch that I had. It's like, what the hell does monograph mean here? Another thing you pointed out, though, and I do want to say, at times it bugged me as I was going through this book, and that is every now and again Ware himself, but I also saw this in Art Spiegelman's introduction, because there's a preface by Ira Glass. Right. There are two introductions, one by Francois Moulet, who is his art editor at The New Yorker, but also there's an introduction by Art Spiegelman, arguably someone who really helped to put Chris Ware on the map, basically gave him his start with Raw.
They're good friends, I think.
And they're good friends. Let me look at this. Let me open this big tome, how Art Spiegelman puts this. He says, Until he starts off his intro, until the day before yesterday, comics, with an X, were dismissed as child's play, and the cartoonists who made them seen as, sorry for the word, but it's accurate, retarded. Now, I know that this is something that Spiegelman brings up again and again and again. Hey guys, I'm trying to fight against this urge to classify comics as kid stuff, and in fact, I will spell comics C-O-M-I-X in order to make this point. You know, I think 10, 15, maybe even, 20 years ago, okay, I'm with you there. There's a part of me, though, that gets annoyed by this because we're at the point now that saying comics are more than just for kids has gotten kind of old. And, when Spiegelman says, just yesterday we were talking about kids and comics, Chris Ware says some of the same things, kind of demeaning it, saying, well, a lot of people don't see comics as serious, and I've had to, fight against that. It's like, well, yeah, at one point you did. Can you say that today, though? And I know in terms of comic scholarship, many of us are at the point, it's like, okay, we're past this, right? So why don't we just take it as a given that it is a legitimate art form and work from there and not keep referring to, the days where it wasn't respected. Even when it comes to mainstream comics, it's something that is taken quite seriously. And another thing that kind of annoys me is, I guess, the subtext in this impulse, right, to say that comics aren't respected. There is this, at times, unspoken dismissing of mainstream comics that gets on my nerves. And, granted, we don't talk about mainstream superhero stuff here on the Comics Alternative, but not because we don't like it or don't appreciate it. It's just that, all the other comics podcasts talk almost exclusively, if not exclusively, about it. So we wanted to do something different. But this kind of dismissing of the seriousness of comics, even the very popular stuff like the superhero genre, gets on my nerves. And so as I was going through this book, every now and again, those little bubbles of annoyance would come up. I mean, I could easily excuse them. Did you feel the same way?
Well, I know what you mean. And it's characteristic of Chris Ware to be excessive in his apologia about, where I think it's intentionally trying to provoke us to be like, no, stop it. You're already legit. Stop worrying about legitimacy. And yet he cannot, like, there's so many pages where they're beautiful essays, but the first paragraph is just sort of like I'm sorry about this, but, but I don't mean to be pretentious or, there's a kind of constant self-reference, and I don't know. I don't know if you've read Chris Pizzino's book, but I think many of the canonical comics of what we now think of as highbrow literary comics have within them that saying Chris Ware is just, it's shot through with that same self-recognition of, even if they don't, and obviously they don't hold comics to be some lesser medium or lowbrow thing. That they always need to reference, that status, and maybe it's a way to head off, to anticipate criticism or dismissal, for the sake of one's own ego, but I do think it is an aspect of their critical commentary, of what those works are doing. I would be really tired of Chris Ware doing that stuff if I didn't do that stuff so often myself, and if he didn't also seem so conscious of that being part of the shtick, I guess, so to speak. Yeah. And very fitting with his character when he talks not about comics, but when he talks about making the various models and toys that he makes, which are also exhibited in this book, which are phenomenal. Right. But also about his personal life, and including photographs of his grandmother, which is like a big part of this story as well. And so I guess I wasn't as annoyed, mostly because I've come to find that to be Chris Ware is,
Yeah, much of this is personality. I mean, I don't know Chris Ware personally, but from what I've seen of him, and not only through his work, but interviews with him, both text-based, video interviews, I mean, he does seem kind of apologetic, at times self-effacing. And so I do think that some of this is his personality. But I just mentioned this kind of, apologia as something that, as you point out, it can be both a preemptive strike against criticism, but at the same time, it is a posed position, right? In other words, by pointing out that, well, historically, comics have not been respected, what individuals, not necessarily Chris Ware here, is doing is setting themselves up to do something that is much better than the comics that came before. And so there is something, to some degree, self-serving by stating this so overtly and so frequently. And so that's one of the reasons why I say I'm a little annoyed when I see this come up over and over again.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, I could excuse Ware because I think part of that is personality, but I've heard Art Spiegelman say this time and time again, that, it's just not respected. I'm doing something that's much more serious, more literary, definitely not like that mainstream stuff. It's like, well, you can dismiss the mainstream stuff, but a lot of other people don't. And those are just as legitimate comics as the more literary highbrow stuff, whatever you want to call it. And I mean, I like, again, if we're going to use high and low, I like the low stuff. I like the high stuff. Why can't we all just get along? And so by pitting one against the other, and this is something that used to every now and again annoy me with Harvey Pekar, God rest his soul, is that he would, say comics are much more than just men in tights and capes and funny animals. It's like, you're right. But comics are also largely defined by people in tights and capes and funny animals. So there's nothing wrong with that. So in setting what you're doing up as something that we should pay attention to, something to be admired, and something serious, you don't necessarily have to tear down the other things around you that preceded you to do so. And again, I don't think that Chris Ware is doing that. I do think that this is more of his personality. But every now and again, when he would point out that, comics really weren't respected, and, I was trying to fight against that trend, it's like, at the time I can see that. But, hey, you're published by The New Yorker. You're well-respected. You're one of the leading comics creators today of any sort. So shut up and just give us the art. Give us books that we can easily hold without our arms falling off.
I mean, and again, preemptively, he's probably said that also at some point to himself and admitted that, and yet he refuses. And that's part of his charm, and also part of what's going to annoy somebody, some people, about this work. But I'm with you. And I know what you mean about that sort of recreating or reinstantiating that artificial division becomes a way of self-perpetuating, and a way of, especially, and I do sense that tone sometimes of propping yourself up. But I also, one of the things this book does is it shows his studio. It shows his, photographs of his workspace where he's constructing these models and all that kind of stuff. And there is in an artist edition kind of way, a lot of republishing of his original art. And for somebody who's read Chris Ware for a long time, walking back through all of this stuff that he's done was really, it just made me re-impressed all over again. There's something like really impressive about the meticulousness and the craft. And then his trick is often then to be showing off how meticulous his craft is, and then to like dump this really like depressing story that doesn't move anywhere. And it does not that it doesn't actually move anywhere, but that's the trick, that's the effect. And so, but it's just, this is a giant, maybe somebody would say navel gazing or self. I don't want to pick any metaphors here, but like self-congratulatory, celebration. But yet the craft is so remarkable. Like looking at these pages of original art and all the kind of stuff that he, there's so many things that Chris Ware does that when you realize that he does it all by hand, it just just kind of knocks your socks off. And that breathtaking aspect of looking at Chris Ware's stuff is definitely there. And I, for one, I like the prose that he couples it with. Like I said, I often find that it sounds like what I sound like in my own head. The self-doubting, the the sort of like sometimes haughty, sometimes like overly humble. That's, I think, what my own interior monologue sounds like, and I hate myself for that. But it fits,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you in terms of the sheer fascination for his art in all of its facets. Mm. And, one of the things that a book like this does when I look at it is to remind me how much I miss Chris Ware on a more regular basis. I mean, I was looking this up right before we started recording today. The last time we had an issue or a book of the Acme Novelty Library, it was with number 20, which came out in November, almost exactly 7 years ago. Came out in 2010. That was it doesn't seem that long ago, but that's the last time that an Acme Novelty Library book came out.
Yeah, I remember that.
Mm-hmm. And it's not as if they would come out that frequent, but at least we would get them semi-frequently.
Right.
And I enjoyed that. Now, apparently he has opted now to do these larger projects that may take a while. So, for instance, something like a building story.
Right.
But I think he even had parts of what eventually became Building Story in an issue or two of Acme Novelty Library, as well as in other places as well. I mean, he's also someone who's now doing things for the New Yorker, so he's got other things to occupy his time. I understand that. I just miss getting Chris Ware comics on a more regular basis.
Yeah.
I want to see more Rusty Brown. I want to see
Rusty Brown. Yeah,
get back to that. I just, the kind of stories that he tells. I mean, I like these larger projects. Don't get me wrong. I just kind of miss the Acme Comedy or Novelty Library.
Novelty.
Now, another question that from what you just said that I had is, earlier we were talking about the potential audience or maybe even the intended audience for Carnival of Contagion. And so I want to ask you, who do you think the audience is for Monograph?
That's a good question. I think it must be, those Chris Ware fans who would plunk down what's the cover price on this thing? I should know because I bought it, but
30. Hold on.
It's 60 something maybe.
Oh, really? I know you can get it for 30 some on Amazon.
Right. Which is what I did. Sorry, local bookstore.
$60.
This is one I didn't pick up from the local shop. But yeah, so I mean, you have to be pretty already in the pocket for Chris Ware to spend that money, and then also to enjoy this much. But I do think that somebody can become a Chris Ware fan, and I think if they like building stories, if they read Jimmy Corrigan, or even, I mean, I have a Chris Ware pile in my comics collection, Quimby, and really even a lot of old stuff. And so this was right. So I am the audience, is what I'm saying. The other thing is, I don't know if you've read the Walton Skeezix volumes that Drawn and Quarterly put out that, Chris Ware has been involved in.
Right.
And I loved those. I loved the comics. It was a discovery of Gasoline Alley for me. I loved the tone. I recognized why Ware puts, Frank King and Harriman in this sort of like, Rushmore. They are doing something so beautiful that I think Chris Ware is a modern sort of like version of. But in those volumes, I think it's Chris Ware and Cheat here, and I'm not sure, maybe Oliveros. They really, dig up similar kinds of artifacts of Frank King's life, photographs of the family on vacation, that kind of stuff. And I remember when I first saw it being like, who cares about this much about Frank King? After reading the Walt and Skeezix volumes and living for years with Walt and Skeezix growing up, I suddenly became really, really curious about the Frank King and his family's life that was behind the creator who was telling these stories. I found myself just really wanting, the comics had pulled out this element of me caring about mundane human lives that suddenly made me really care about Frank King. And I feel like Chris Ware now does that same thing for himself, which is kind of funny. But, I read a lot of his work with this strong sense that there is a heavy autobiographical or, there's a heavy, very personal tone, sense of memory to it. And I was struck in this book, particularly by his reminiscences of his grandmother, which he mentions quite often.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that experience of seeing her lose her memory, this woman who was so, instrumental to raising him. And I feel like his project is this large, attempt to, through print and publication and material creation, make memory last. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think this book is. So it felt a little bit self-indulgent, but here I was indulging in it with him and really liking it. So I guess I was the sucker this was made for.
Yeah. Well, when I ask you, who do you think the audience is here? Yeah. It's definitely not your average comics reader.
Yes.
You may be able to find something like this at your local comic shop, right, but I don't think that many people would buy it there. I do think that people who are diehard Chris Ware fans are definitely, you and I, would definitely get this book, as we did. But also I think people who are interested in comic studies and comics history would get this book. I think another potential audience is those who see comics as art product. One of the things we were talking about is in this book is not only a reproduction of some of the art in his books that have actually come out, things he hasn't published yet or never published, drafts and whatnot, but also photographs of the various toys and objects that he has created that are associated in one form or another with the kind of comics that he creates. The book itself is arguably one of those projects itself, because there are a few pages where you have small pamphlets interlaid in the book itself to where you open a page and there is something like almost like a mini comic in there that you can open and the back is glued to the page. And so you have a text within a text. And so the comic art as object, which largely defines what Chris Ware does, is, I think, part and parcel of what this book is. And so I think those who see comics as a potential art object, whether it be something like a large coffee table book, again, if we want to call it that, or the way that he puts together objects in ways that are influenced by and add to, kind of like the paratexts of his actual comics.
Yeah.
And those people are going to really love this book as well.
Yeah.
But I do think it has a relatively limited audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think, again, we wouldn't be discussing this book if we weren't going to recommend it to our listeners. But, even if you're not a big Chris Ware fan, it is something fascinating, and we recommend that you get it. To me, this is something akin to what we mentioned at the top of the show when we were talking about Kid Lobotomy, IDW artist editions. This is not the exact same thing, of course.
Right.
And it's not near as expensive. It is expensive, but it's something that does give you an inside look at a particular artist and, a creator. Although here we don't have just one kind of title or one text.
Right.
This is the body of Chris Ware's work up to this point.
Yeah. And of course, the qualifier is that, Chris Ware refuses to subsume his comics to somebody's notion of accessibility. So but if you were going to buy this, you knew that already. So
right.
Probably don't have to get. There's not an iPad version of this.
We were talking about early on the kind of self-deprecating personality of Chris Ware, almost to the point of, we think the lady doth protest too much. I was looking at just now the Amazon page for this, and under the description, which was written by the publisher, and whether it's written by a publicist or by Chris Ware himself, who knows?
Right.
But it starts off by describing this book as a flabbergasting experiment in publishing hubris. Okay. And so that more or less underscores what you and I were talking about, the self-effacing nature of what Chris Ware does, which to a point I can understand. On the other hand, there's something a little annoying about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Nonetheless, all that being said, Chris Ware is a major figure, an important cartoonist, and we should definitely check out this book.
Yes, yeah, I agree. If all this talk that we've been doing makes you enticed, then you are the target. You're the mark. And we do recommend that you look at it.
Well, Paul, we looked at 3 very different titles. We started off with Kid Lobotomy issues 1 and 2, written by Peter Milligan with art by Tess Fowler, part of IDW's new Black Crown imprint. After that, we looked at an educational comic, Carnival of Contagion, written by Bob Hall along with John West and Judy Diamond, with art by Bob Hall. And then we wrapped up with the self-effacing Chris Ware and his behemoth Monograph. So, if you want to build muscle, upper body strength, then definitely pick up Monograph and just lift it.
That's right.
Maybe read a few pages each day. Just stand up, hold the book, bring it close to your face, and read 5 pages, holding your arms like that, and then set it down. The next day, you can read 5 more pages by doing that. And before you know it, you'll be Charles Atlas.
Charles Atlas, that's right. Get your vaccinations.
That's right.
Don't get a lobotomy. And pick up Monograph repeatedly. And there you go. Your road to health and
That's
wellness.
Right. Those are the lessons to glean from this week's episode of the Comics Alternative.
Oh, man, look at all that the Comics Alternative provides you. But actually, on a serious note, Black Crown looks really cool. Shelly Bond is a treasure. Graphic Medicine is a treasure. To me, to us, Chris Ware is a treasure. I think it's really cool, Derek. Let me just say, you're a treasure, too, because just being a place where all the variety of kinds of comics come through, and the output of this podcast on a regular basis, thanks to your hard work and of course all the others that are part of the crew, is fun. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, it's not just my hard work, as you pointed out. I mean, I couldn't do this without everyone else who's involved with this. So, you and Gwen and everyone. So, this is.
I do a little bit.
This is a group project, and it's something that we do like to bring in quite a variety of different comics. And another plus about the Comics Alternative, we don't refer to ourselves as geeks or nerds or anything like that. In other words, we're not as self-effacing as Chris Ware is. Again, we're not going to define ourselves like this. We're people who are serious about comics, and we're serious about a variety of different comics, both the artsy-fartsy stuff and the popular lowbrow kind.
That's right.
Yeah. And if you want to find both artsy-fartsy and lowbrow comics, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. They have the whole kit and caboodle. They have everything.
That's right.
You won't believe the variety of comics that they have, and at incredible discounts. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us. 2guys@comicsalternative.com is the general address. We also have individual addresses. Derek@comicsalternative.com, and I'm Paul@comicsalternative.com. We'd love to hear from you, some of your takes and opinions on the books that we talked about. If you disagree gently, but we always love dialogue. here and in some of the other following forums that you're just about to hear. Derek will tell us.
That's right. You can contact us through a variety of social media outlets. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and now Slack. Don't forget our Slack channel. You can subscribe to the Comics Alternative through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And until next time, I'm Paul.
And I'm Derek.
Bye-bye.
Hey, what happened?